Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here tonight with the Houston Audubon Society, which is one of the most active chapters in the country and one of the ones that's done the most for the conservation of birds and other animals. So it's a real honor and pleasure to be here to celebrate this event, since I was involved in the early beginnings of Houston Audubon, not the very first meetings, but shortly thereafter with some of the folks that got it started. Birding in the Houston area goes back, of course, way before the 25 years of the Houston Audubon Society, and it parallels the development of birding in the United States, which occurred after the turn of the century with the development of field glasses and binoculars so that people could look at birds rather than shooting them. The early people that studied birds were scientists that to see a bird close up you had to shoot it, and then with binoculars you could look at it through the binoculars and get a good look at it. And then later better bird books came about, of course the Chapman book and then Roger Tory Peterson's book, which I believe was about 1934. But one of the real old-timers who's not around anymore, who died about 5 years ago, was Joe Heiser, and he was birding in the 1920s in the Houston area. And not too long after that, a man moved to Houston who's now 93, still living in West University, Dr. George Williams of Rice University, a very close friend of mine. I talked to George tonight. He wasn't able to come. He said to give everyone his regards, and that he moved to Houston and he heard about Joe Heiser, and he found out from the Audubon Society in New York that there was a member in Houston named Joe Heiser, and he was looking for another birder. Houston was, needless to say, much smaller in 1932, and there were not that many birders, and he was looking for a kindred spirit. He looked the name Joe Heiser up in the phone book, called him, and they became very, very close friends and did a lot to further birding and conservation in the Houston area. And I asked George to just show you some of the changes since 1932, where they birded. And they would bird particularly around the San Jacinto River bottom. There was no Lake Houston then. They would bird around Sheldon Reservoir, and they would bird down the west side of Galveston Bay around Kemah. In fact, Joe had a summer place at Kemah, and actually he at one point he worked for the Texaco Oil Company, bought a cabin in the Kemah area, and he and his friends used to go there and see tremendous waves of migrants coming through. And that's one of the first places they got exposed to bird migration. They would bird down the west side of Galveston Bay onto Galveston, and they birded Galveston a lot. And they very seldom went to East Texas, to Bolivar, or to High Island, or that area. They mainly birded the Galveston area and right around Houston. Occasionally they would go to western Harris County to see caracaras and the great concentrations of geese. Of course, you didn't have to go out so far then because the city stopped much earlier than it does now. It wasn't spread out so much. They were very interested in shorebirds. They studied shorebirds a lot. And George Williams told me that before their efforts in the 1930s, 20s and 30s, very little was known from a national standpoint about shorebird migration in the Texas upper Gulf Coast area or any of this part. There were very few reports. A lot of the early bird work was on the East Coast and the West Coast. And we were in this great wasteland as it was viewed. And they studied shorebirds, and George Williams wrote an article that was published in the Auk about shorebirds in this area. They were very interested in shorebirds. They got very interested in migration. And George, on his own, started a little mimeograph publication called the Gulf Coast Migrant. And he put it out for 15 years. And one of our speakers tonight is Greg Lasley, who devotes tireless hours to Audubon American Birds, or what used to be Audubon Field Notes, and the Texas Bird Records Committee. And it's these people that devote time like that that have built up the knowledge of the birds of our area. So those were some of the early birders, Joe Heiser and George Williams and some of their friends, and those were some of the areas they went. And one of the things they were particularly interested in was migration. And George Williams got into a big controversy with George Lowry, very mentor and very close friend of John O'Neill's, over the question of, do birds migrate over the Gulf of Mexico, or do they migrate around the Gulf? And George Williams pointed out that no one really had documented that they migrated over the Gulf. They were seen in Yucatan, then they returned up in Louisiana and Texas, and the assumption was made they flew across the Gulf. So they had a very spirited discussion in the ornithological journals about this issue. And it was funny because it was almost like George is in Louisiana saying, oh yeah, the birds come to Louisiana right across the Gulf, and George is here in Texas and say, no, they come right through Texas. It was almost a parochial thing about what area they come through. But radar studies showed that there was some of both. Some go around the Gulf and many go across the Gulf. But it was a very interesting discussion. Just a few other things that I think are real interesting. One of the things that happened from the early days, as you might imagine, was a tremendous increase in knowledge about birds. In the early days, in a way it was really neat because very little was known and people would just go out and look at whatever was there, and they all were like it was all a new wonderful world of birds that they knew very little was known. So they weren't particularly looking for any particular rare birds or chasing after rarities, which is a wonderful thing to do, but their focus was just getting to know the birds of an area that wasn't very well known. And just a few examples of some of the advances or changes in knowledge. When I started out birding, which was about 1948, the Sprague's pipit was virtually unknown. People didn't know where it was. They didn't know that it wintered in this area. It was known as a very rare bird. And then Frank Watson discovered that it liked very short grass prairies. It wasn't around ponds like what used to be called the water pipit, the American pipit. It was in very short grass prairies, and when we would flush it, it would fly up in an angle like this and get to a certain height and then drop like a rock. And he observed that habit, and then we knew where to look for it. Another one I remember very well, personally, was the Hudsonian godwit. This is a magnificent shorebird that I had never seen when I had been birding around Houston in the early days. And I didn't know anyone that had seen one. And maybe there were people that had seen one, but I hadn't seen one, never knew where to look for it. And then I was reading the old Audubon field notes, and there was a report from southwestern Louisiana by, I believe it was John G., who lives near Austin now, that he had found 100 Hudsonian godwits in a rice field near Cameron, Louisiana. And I thought, that's it. That's where we need to go look for. And this was like May the 15th. So it told me the habitat and the date. And we stopped birding at the end of April because it got hot and we didn't really concentrate on the migration. I think really a lot of people do that now, and there's a lot of interesting migration in May. Anyway, I remember reading that and very shortly going out, I think with Ronald Fowler, a friend of mine, and driving down towards Freeport, which we didn't bird in those days. That was not an area we birded, but driving down that way and finding a rice field near Arcola. Stopped at the first rice field we found, and there out in the rice field was a gray shorebird, not a willet, too big for a willet. We knew it was a godwit. We flushed it. It had a black and white tail, a big black and white wing stripe. There was our lifer Hudsonian godwit, and then we knew where to look for them. And in those days, before that, we hadn't known. There are other things that turned up, of course. And if you look at some of the very early Christmas counts, people listed black-capped chickadee for this area. Of course, there are no documented reports in the entire state of Texas, I believe. Certainly not for the Houston area. But people didn't know how to tell it from the Carolina chickadee. They thought that the black-capped chickadee was the one that was here. Another thing that happened fairly recently was the semi-palmated sandpiper. We thought it was here in the winter. Alan Phillips pointed out that there were no specimens for North America from Texas or hardly anywhere except the extreme tip of Florida in the winter. It caused us to look more closely at these birds and realize that we were misidentifying western sandpipers in the winter and that there weren't any semi-palmated sandpipers here in the winter. So those were some of the changes in bird knowledge. Obviously, there's been a vast amount learned. There's a vast amount yet to learn. There have been a lot of changes in birding in terms of infrastructure. We didn't have the highways now that you have now. We couldn't get to Highland in an hour and a half or less, depending on how fast you drive. We didn't have all the refuges we have now. We didn't have Brazos Bend. We didn't have the Anahuac Refuge. We didn't have Brazoria. There weren't as many refuges. So the infrastructure has changed for the better in some ways, that you can get places faster, and there are more preserved areas, and there's more literature about where the birds are. But there have been some changes for the worse, too. There's more congestion. The highways are busier. The population has increased. Pollution has increased. And areas that we birded right around Baytown and the San Jacinto River bottoms are not as good now because of the pollution of that area. And of course, there's been a lot of urban sprawl out into the Katy Prairie, as you're well aware. And of course, there's the danger of the airport going out there, which would make things worse. The philosophy of birding has changed to some extent in that now there's more of an emphasis on going out and looking for rarities and going to certain sites where people have seen birds rather than exploring as much as we used to, because we didn't know as much. We didn't know these sites. And I think it's wonderful to find rarities and look for them, but it's also wonderful, as in the old days we did, and I'm sure there are people that do it now, to study the common birds and find out more about them. I was talking to George Williams, and he said he always felt that with a common bird, that that there was always something more to see. There was always something more to learn about a common bird. And so sometimes I feel there's a tendency of people to look for what they call only the good birds. And I feel all birds are good birds. And it's very interesting to look at a blue jay or cardinal. They're beautiful, and there's always something more to learn about them if you observe them closely. Plus, they're just beautiful creatures. So there wasn't quite the emphasis we have now on rarities and on lifers. We didn't hear as much talk about that. There was more of a general just going out and looking at birds. As far as there also, of course, there were efforts at conservation, and there were some wonderful things done. Joe Heiser was one of the founders of Texas Nature Conservancy, one of the founders of the Outdoor Nature Club, one of the people that was instrumental in creating the Little Ticket Nature Sanctuary. But there's a lot more done in conservation now. Birders in general are much more involved in conservation. That's a wonderful development. As far as the future, I see the development that I see people seeking more knowledge about birds, learning more about birds, learning more about their habits, more interested in delving more deeply into things like migration, where the birds come from, where the birds are going, the tempo of migration. I think that I see with the literature and with the people that are taking classes in birds and the kind of bird field trips you have here, an increasing appreciation for birds in all forms of nature. One of the things about the early birders here is they were all-around naturalists, and that tradition continues in Houston Audubon. To say there's a tremendous effort in conservation now, and there are a lot of unsolved problems to work on in birding, and a lot more to be done. So there's been a wonderful evolution of birding. There are a lot more people doing it. There are a lot more to learn about birds, and despite the development, Houston is one of the great areas of the world for bird watching, and it's fortunate to have a wonderful organization like Houston Audubon to carry on the fight for conservation and to provide the leadership in bird appreciation and bird study. And I salute you on your 25th birthday.